My name is Thomas Mitchell, and the day my son died, something else happened that none of you expected. His wife stood at my elbow during the funeral and told me to leave the house I had built with my own hands years ago. She looked right at me and said, "Stop crying and get out of my house now," as if grief and ownership were the same thing, and I had no right to either. Picture the scene. People whispering in the pews, flowers stacked like quiet accusations, a black dress that wasn't mourning so much as performance, and Victoria, composed and sharp, speaking with the confidence of someone convinced she held all the facts. She called me a burden. She said I was a drain. She said David had been supporting me and that now everything was hers, the house, the insurance, the life she imagined she was inheriting. And for a moment, I let the words land like stones because I wanted to see how far she would go. Sometimes silence tells a story louder than any argument. I remember building that house in 1987. The sound of saws, the smell of fresh-cut lumber, the list of measurements scrawled on the back of old envelopes, the way Margaret and I argued over paint swatches and then laughed about it. Those memories are stitched into the crown molding and the hardwood floors I installed with David when he was 12 and into the kitchen table where we'd eaten the cheap but delicious meals of family who worked with their hands and planned for the future together. Victoria had lived here for 8 years and acted like she'd earned it by default, assuming that being the widow meant being the owner. She assumed David wrote the checks, signed the deeds, and controlled the money. She saw my weathered hands, the old Honda in the driveway, and mistook simplicity for weakness, thrift for poverty, humility for helplessness. At the funeral reception, she cornered me in my own kitchen and handed me a list like I was a tenant being given notice. 30 days, she said politely. That should be enough for you to find somewhere more appropriate. Places for people in your situation, programs that help seniors, as if the life Margaret and I had spent 4 decades building could be condensed into a brochure and a few government forms. It wasn't the house that stunned the most. It was a systematic erasure. Margaret's photos boxed up, the mantel cleared of 50 years of family evidence, David's drawings removed from the refrigerator like they were expendable art. She was redecorating my history with the confident, brisk gestures of someone already spending money in her mind. But Victoria had made a critical assumption, one that would unravel her certainty if I ever chose to answer it. She assumed David owned what she was claiming. She never asked to see the deed, never requested a mortgage statement, never inquired about insurance paperwork, and she took for granted that support meant ownership instead of help. I could have shouted and scandalized the room. I could have made a scene and rustled private papers like a man trying to prove himself loudest in the crowd. But instead, I went downstairs to the basement where I kept my files like a squirrel keeps nuts for winter, neatly labeled drawers, receipts and contracts filed by decade, property tax records, insurance bills, everything in my name. I didn't have to show her anything that day because I wanted to choose a moment when the reveal would matter, when the lesson would land with the people who had watched her rewrite our story without a single document. She was finishing the hole she had started digging for me by talking louder and louder, convincing the neighbors, the mourners, and even old friends that I was a defeated, dependent man she claimed I was. She was betting on the kind of truth most people accept without asking for proof. I made coffee instead and started a list. What Victoria thought she had, a 4-bedroom house on Maple Street, for $120,000 in perceived market value, $150,000 in life insurance she had already mentally allocated, and what I actually had lined up on paper, deeds, receipts, decades of statements, and a trust Margaret and I had set up years before that made clear who controlled what. I let her keep telling herself the story. Let her keep spending the imaginary money in her head. Sometimes the smartest strategy is to let the other person dig until their shovel hits the bedrock. And Victoria was about to hit bedrock she hadn't expected. She believed she had all the cards. 3 days later, she would learn who really held the papers and why assumptions can be ruinously expensive. I spent the next morning like a man sharpening a tool. Calm, deliberate, methodical, because anger is a poor substitute for paperwork, and the truth almost always hides in the margins of the ledger. I walked down to the basement with a mug of coffee and the memory of a life Margaret and I had carefully documented in stacks of folders. And as I pulled open drawer after drawer, the story of ownership read back at me in black and white. The deed signed in 1987 with my name on it, not David's. Tax receipts paid in my checkbook year after year. Insurance policies that listed me as the policyholder. Utility accounts that had my account numbers. Contracts for repairs I negotiated and paid for myself. And tucked into a back folder marked Trust Documents, Private. A typewritten trust agreement Margaret had insisted we set up years before anyone thought we needed it. A trust clearly designed for contingency and continuity that named the Thomas and Margaret Mitchell Family Trust as the holder of title and spelled out the distribution rules in language. So exact it left no room for the kind of assumptions Victoria had been operating on for 2 months. I sat at the kitchen table and spread the papers out like cards on a table and felt oddly like a gambler who'd been dealt the winning hand but chose to wait for the right moment to reveal it. I called Margaret Collins, my longtime attorney, a woman as precise with the law as I had been with financial ledgers, and brought her over that afternoon with 3 manila folders that made her eyebrows lift in a way I remembered from years of quieter consultations about wills and taxes. "Tom," she said softly as we began, "you've been meticulous." And I shrugged because Margaret used to laugh at my habit of keeping everything. But she also used to say that a life without paper is a life without proof, and proof was exactly what we now needed. We made a plan that wasn't about vengeance, but about correcting a narrative that had already done real harm to my dignity. Margaret drew up a concise set of demands and notices, immediate clarification that Victoria was a tenant, not an owner, presentation of proof to her and to anyone she told otherwise, an invitation to settle the situation reasonably by paying market rent if she wished to remain, and failing that, a formal 30-day notice consistent with what she had already demanded of me. But more than paperwork, we wanted witnesses, because Victoria had performed her cruelty in public and truth deserved at least the same stage. I asked Margaret to let her colleagues at Premier Realty hear the facts. Her office could be the place where the assumptions would meet the documents, and I wanted the 3 women who'd walked through my house, calling a museum, to see the deed that listed my name in plain type. Preparation felt almost meditative, organizing copies, stamping envelopes, making phone calls, and while Margaret marshaled legal language, I rehearsed nothing. I didn't need spectacle, only clarity. On Tuesday morning, we walked in Premier Realty quietly. Margaret in her sober suit, me with the same slow posture I've carried for years in the room, with its glossy brochures and stage calm, paused. Victoria's smile faltered when we announced we needed to speak about the estate. The blonde agent who'd gasped at my crown molding looked suddenly uncertain, and in a moment that felt oddly like a stage reveal, Margaret handed over the deed and the trust documents. You could see the air leave Victoria's chest as she read the deed that declared, in unambiguous terms, that the property was owned by Thomas Mitchell and had been for decades, funded and maintained by him, and the trust that named the trust, not her, as beneficiary of David's life insurance. Her posture dissolved from combative to pale, to defensively small, as the room filled with the sounds of papers rustling and whispers of recognition. She stammered that David had always taken care of the bills, that she'd seen him make transfers, that she'd assumed his name on bills meant ownership, but the records told a different story. David had been a beneficiary of a generous, paternal structure, one that I had funded and managed and that had been designed to protect my family's continuity, not a hand automatic ownership, to a spouse who never asked to see the paperwork. The office buzzed, clients shifted uncomfortably, and by noon 3 current clients had quietly requested new representation. Victoria's broker called her in, and her colleagues looked at her with a distance that felt like censure. Victoria hired counsel who tried to negotiate a stay on the timeline, offering pay rent below market and requesting 6 months to transition. Margaret countered with a demand for market rent paid up front and a security deposit. Simple fairness for the use of private property. And when the attorney balked, we filed notices that made the situation legally clear. She had 30 days, the same 30 days she'd handed me, to arrange her affairs. In the weeks that followed, the social math calcified into consequences. Clients left, referrals dried up, gossip became an economy that no professional wants to trade in, and Victoria's confident narrative unraveled into the awkward task of explaining what she'd assumed without proof. Meanwhile, my life settled back into its quiet rhythms. Church on Sunday, coffee with Helen, the satisfaction of seeing Margaret's photos return to mantle, and the unexpected peace that comes from knowing your record is straight and your dignity intact. I could have gloated or sought a spectacle, but the real victory was simpler clarity, documentation, and the knowledge that assumptions, once exposed to facts, usually don't survive. And as the neighborhood recalibrated, people who had jumped to conclusions began to ask questions, which is the smallest, most important thing anyone can learn after a mistake like Victoria's. But just as I thought the storm had cleared, a new complication arrived. A lawyer's letter that changed the rules of engagement and proved that truth, while powerful, often brings its own when the letter arrived Tuesday afternoon. Slipped to the mail slot with a casual thud of something pretending not to matter, I recognized the posture of legal stationery immediately and felt a familiar old tension rise in my chest. Not fear, but the alertness of a man who has lived his whole life, knowing that paperwork can tell the truth or disguise it depending on the hands that prepare it. I set the envelope on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long moment, sipping the lukewarm remnants of morning coffee. And when I finally opened it, the language inside was both predictable and absurdly desperate. Victoria's new attorney had drafted a request, thinly disguised as a demand, that I reconsider the eviction timeline and provide reasonable accommodations for her unexpected hardship, as if the hardship had blown in from nowhere instead of being the direct result of her own arrogance. They claimed she had been unaware of the true financial structure of her marital household, which was technically correct, but conveniently ignored the fact that she had never bothered to ask a single question while making life-changing decisions. Still, I wasn't angry. I felt something closer to pity, the kind a grown man feels watching someone realize, far too late, that consequences are part of adulthood. Before responding, I walked through the house, touching the door frames I'd sanded smooth decades ago, the kitchen cabinets Margaret had picked from a worn catalog, the stair rail David and I had installed when he was 12 and proud of his small but steady hands. I let the memories anchor me before I made any decision at all. I thought about the Sunday when Victoria dragged her colleagues through these rooms, calling the place outdated, calling me outdated, waving her hands at the walls as though they could be torn down without tearing history with them. I thought about the day she printed a timeline for my eviction and handed it to me with the confidence of someone certain she owned more than she actually did. I thought about the humiliating performance she had given at the funeral, using grief as a stage too, announcer control over a house she'd never questioned. And then I sat down and reread the letter. It was clumsy work, legal language stretched like thin fabric over arguments that didn't hold weight. They requested an extension of 6 months to facilitate stable relocation. They added in a line about emotional distress, hers, not mine, and attempted to imply that my actions were abrupt, unfair, and retaliatory. They ended with suggestion that, if needed, they were prepared to contest the ownership structure in court, which would have been laughable if it weren't so telling. It meant Victoria still didn't understand the depth of the documentation she was up against. I called Margaret Collins, placed the letter flat on the table, and explained the situation, listening as her voice sharpened into the efficient tone of a woman who has dealt with flimsy threats for decades. "Let them contest," she said. "Threatening a lawsuit doesn't make one possible. The deed, the trust, the records, this case wouldn't last 10 minutes in front of the judge." She recommended we hold firm on the 30-day notice and send a polite but immovable reply. And while she drafted the response, I found myself looking out the window at the driveway where David used to park his car after late-night study sessions, where he'd once hugged me tightly after passing an engineering exam he'd been certain he would fail, where he had told me, quietly, almost shyly, that he was grateful for everything I had done for him, the help, the support, the guidance. It struck me then that Victoria had never really known David's values. She'd known his salary, his career, his smile, but she never understood where his strength came from, how rooted he was in the life we'd built together. And that thought, strangely enough, softened something in me. I scanned the letter again and imagined her sitting somewhere in a half-packed office, scared now in a way she hadn't been before, because illusion is easier to lose than security, and maybe she was realizing that she had gambled a life on nothing more than unverified assumptions. When Margaret finished the draft reply, it was clean, direct, professional. The timeline stands, the ownership is irrefutable, and any attempt to contest it will be met with the full documentation and legal support we hold. I signed it without hesitation and sealed it in the same quiet way I'd watched the house's foundation settle decades ago, steady and slow. Just before the mailman arrived, though, something odd happened, a knock on the door, firm but uncertain, and when I opened it, I found someone I hadn't expected to see standing on my porch, holding a box I recognized instantly. And the moment I saw what was inside that box, I understood that Victoria wasn't the only one whose assumptions were about to be shattered. The man on my porch was Mike Thompson, my son's closest friend since their freshman year of college, and in his hands was a cardboard box that hadn't belonged to Victoria at all but to David, labeled in his handwriting. The slanted half-print he'd used for everything from grocery lists to engineering notes, and stamped with a faded sticker from a storage unit I'd forgotten they once rented together for a school project. Mike looked uneasy, like someone arriving with news he wasn't sure how to deliver, and before I could even ask, he said, "Tom, this was at my place. I think you're supposed to have it." He handed me the box, and his eyes shifted away, as though its contents carried weight he didn't want to touch any longer, and when I set it on the kitchen table and lifted the flaps, the smell of old paper and dust rose up like history breathing. Inside were notebooks, receipts, printouts, and at the very bottom, a red spiral-bound journal with David's name written on the cover, not in his neat handwriting, but hurriedly, like he'd intended to hide it rather than label it. Mike hovered near the door, unsure if he should stay or leave, until I motioned for him to sit. The house felt strangely still as I pulled the journal out and opened the first page. There were entries, short, scattered, sometimes only a sentence long, written over the past 2 years, the very years Victoria claimed David had been supporting me financially. And in the first entry, he wrote something that made my breath catch. "Dad, help me again this month. Someday I hope Victoria understands that he's the reason we've been able to stay afloat." I felt the room tilt as I turned the page. Entry after entry detailed small truths Victoria never knew. How their medical bills during her ankle surgery had drained their savings. How David had accepted assistance from the family trust without wanting to burden his wife with the knowledge. How he'd been planning to tell her once their finances stabilized but kept postponing it because he didn't want her to feel embarrassed or insecure. Mike swallowed hard and admitted he'd known some of it. At least the parts David had confided during late-night talks at the office or while grabbing beers after stressful weeks, and he looked ashamed for not correcting Victoria sooner, especially after hearing her boast publicly about managing the household finances, while assuming David was paying for everyone. But what struck me most wasn't the money. It was the fear embedded in David's words, the fear of being misunderstood by the person he had married. He'd written things like, "I love her, but she hates the idea of needing help," and "maybe once work picks up again, I can stop pulling from the trust," and the phrase that hurt most, "I hope someday she sees Dad the way I do." I closed the journal gently, the way you close a wound that needs time to heal, and thanked Mike for bringing it. He hesitated before leaving, asking if I planned to show Victoria the journal. But I wasn't sure. Some truths are weapons that deliver at the wrong moment, and I didn't want to use David's private thoughts as ammunition, not even against someone who had treated me so cruelly. After Mike left, I sat alone in the quiet house, the journal resting beside the legal letters, the contrast between them stark, one filled with assumptions and threats, the other with quiet confessions and gratitude. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a pang of something other than anger or resolve. I felt grief, real, raw grief, not just for my son, but for the distorted version of him that Victoria had constructed out of pride and ignorance. I knew then that the confrontation still ahead wouldn't just be about deeds and documents. It would be about the truth of who David actually was, and her reckoning with that truth would be far more painful than losing any house. As I reached to close the box, something thin and metallic slid free between the pages of the journal, a small, sealed envelope with my name on it in David's handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before the accident. And the moment I saw that date, I realized whatever David had written inside was never meant for Victoria's eyes, but it was absolutely meant for mine, and it would change everything about what I planned to do next. I stared at the envelope for a long moment, my name written in David's familiar hand, steady but rushed, as though he'd written it between responsibilities, squeezing emotion between obligations the way he'd always done. The date in the corner, just 2 weeks before the accident, sat like a weight on my chest, heavier than any document Victoria had tried to wield against me, and I felt my fingers tremble as I slid a nail under the flap and opened it carefully, almost reverently, afraid that even the slightest tear might erase something irreplaceable. The letter inside was only a single page, folded twice, wore at the creases from time or worry, or maybe because David had carried it for days before deciding what to do with it. I unfolded it slowly, and the moment I saw the first sentence, my breath caught the way it hadn't since the day the police came to my door with the news. "Dad, if anything happens to me before I straighten things out with Victoria, I need you to know the truth. I sank into the chair like a man who'd been pushed from behind, the kitchen spinning slightly as I read on. David explained that he'd been meaning to tell Victoria about the trust, about the financial support I'd given him quietly and steadily, about the allowances set aside specifically for family stability. But he'd hesitated because she'd grown increasingly sensitive about money, how hard she worked compared to others, how she believed independence meant never needing help, never accepting help, never admitting vulnerability. He wrote that he didn't want her to feel lesser or embarrassed, and that he let the secrecy go on too long, believing he would find the perfect moment to explain everything when stress wasn't high and tempers weren't short. He confessed that he'd seen her resentment grow, misdirected and unspoken, each time he brought groceries here or fixed something around the house, and he admitted he'd been afraid to correct her assumptions because he wanted peace more than honesty, choosing temporary quiet over long-term clarity. "I know she thinks I'm supporting you," he wrote. "But the truth is you've been supporting both of us more than she ever realized, and I'm scared of how she'll react when she finds out." He wrote about how she'd struggled after her job slowed down, how embarrassed she was by needing to rely on him, how she'd started resenting anything that looked like dependence, his or hers, and how that resentment had slowly twisted into pride, then defensiveness, then assumptions so deeply rooted she never questioned them. And then there was a line that hit me harder than any accusation Victoria had thrown my way. "Dad, please be kind to her when the truth comes out. She won't handle it well, but she isn't malicious. She's scared." I sat there with the letter open, feeling both punched and comforted, because David, even in worry, was trying to take care of all of us, bridging gaps he never had enough time to close. His understanding of Victoria was deeper than I'd allowed myself to consider. She wasn't cruel out of evil, he insisted, but out of insecurity, fear of losing control, fear of needing help she didn't want to acknowledge, fear of losing him. And when he died, those fears calcified into brittle certainty she wielded against me, certainty backed not by evidence but by desperation. I folded the letter again and pressed it flat, my fingers lingering on his handwriting as if I could hold on to him through the ink. I didn't forgive Victoria in that moment, but I understood something new. She had been grieving too, but instead of collapsing inward, she'd lashed outward, striking at the nearest target, me, because the truth she didn't know was the truth that terrified her most. I set the envelope down beside the trust papers and stared at the contrast between them, one a legal shield, the other an emotional key, and I realized I couldn't handle the next confrontation with only one of them. If I was going to face Victoria, I needed to decide whether I would give her only the facts or also give her the truth David had wanted her to hear. And just as that thought settled, the doorbell rang, sharp, insistent, almost panicked, and when I opened the door, I found Victoria on my porch, eyes red, hands shaking, holding something I never expected her to bring back. And the moment she spoke, I realized she hadn't come to argue. She'd come because something had happened that neither of us was prepared for. Victoria stood on my porch like a woman whose world had tilted so hard she couldn't find her footing, her makeup smeared as if she tried to hold herself together in the car and failed somewhere between the ignition and my driveway, and in her hands, not a folder, not another ultimatum, not more paperwork, was David's old leather wallet, the one he'd carried since college, worn smooth along the edges and scuffed from years of being shoved into pockets and backpacks. She held it like it was, radioactive, something she couldn't bear to keep, but couldn't bear to let go of either. "Tom," she whispered, her voice fraying at the edges, "I found this in one of his things, and I don't understand what it means." Her eyes flicked up, full of fear and confusion instead of the cold superiority she'd worn like armor for months, and she stepped inside only after I nodded, setting the wallet carefully on the kitchen table, as though simply touching it might change her memory of him. She opened it slowly, revealing a few folded receipts, a worn library card, 2 old photos, one of her, one of me and David fishing at Lake Erie. And then she slid out what she had come to show me, a neatly folded piece of paper tucked behind his driver's license. The edges softened from years of riding against leather. She placed it between us like evidence. I recognized it instantly. It was a copy of the trust summary, the same one I'd given David years ago so he could understand how the structure worked, how disbursements were organized, how financial support flowed, what could be accessed, and under what conditions. Victoria stared at it as though it had been written in an alphabet she didn't recognize. "What is this?" she finally asked. I didn't answer immediately, not to be cruel, but because I wanted to choose words carefully. This wasn't the moment for legal lectures or triumph. It's a document explaining the trust your husband was part of, I said gently. The trust Margaret and I created. Her hands trembled as she touched the paper. He carried this around with him, she whispered. He carried this everywhere. She looked up at me with something like dawning horror. Tom, why didn't I know about any of this? There was no anger left in her voice, only a hollow ache. I pulled out a chair for her and sat across from her, the trust document lying between us like a quiet truth finally stepping into the light. Because David didn't know how to tell you, I said. He didn't want you to feel ashamed or left out or dependent. Her face crumpled at the word dependent. She pressed her palm against her forehead, like she was trying to hold her skull together. I thought I knew everything about our finances. I thought he was paying for the house. For you. For everything. I nodded. I know. And you just... Let me believe it? She asked, her voice cracking. You never corrected me. You didn't ask, I said softly. And you didn't want to hear anything that didn't fit the story you'd already decided was true. She flinched as though the truth physically struck her. She looked at the trust summary again, reading the word with a heaviness that made her seem suddenly smaller, younger, vulnerable in a way I'd never seen. So everything I thought was based on assumptions. I finished. She swallowed, tears sliding down her cheek. Tom, I treated you horribly. I talked to people about you like I was taking care of you, like you were some burden I had to drag through life. You did, I said calmly, not to wound her, but because truth loses its power when softened. She nodded, accepting it without protest. I told everyone David was supporting you financially, she whispered. But he wasn't. You were supporting him, supporting us. And I didn't know. She looked almost sick. How could I not know? I hesitated for a long moment before answering. Because David loved you enough to protect your pride. Her eyes widened, and a sob slipped out before she could stop it. She covered her mouth, shoulders shaking, as realization after realization poured through her, each one sharpening the edges of grief she'd been holding at arm's length. Tom, she whispered, voice breaking, I didn't come here about the house. I don't care about any of that anymore. Something happened today, and I don't know what to do. I leaned forward, steady, bracing myself for whatever she was about to say. What happened? She took a shaky breath and lifted her eyes to mine, fear sitting heavy behind them. Tom, I think someone else knew about the trust, and they've been trying to get to it before either of us understood what was really going on. The phone vibrated against the kitchen counter with the insistence of something that refused to be ignored, and when I glanced at the caller ID, a cold recognition swept through me. First National Trust Office, the same institution that had managed a family trust for nearly 4 decades. They never called unless something urgent, unusual, or deeply complicated was happening, and certainly not without scheduling it first. I answered slowly, my eyes still on Victoria as she held David's letter like a fragile relic. Mr. Mitchell, the voice said, clipped professional, but tinged with tension I hadn't heard in all my years working with them. We apologize for short notice, but we've discovered an issue that requires your immediate attention. My hand tightened on the phone. What kind of issue? The representative hesitated, and in that brief pause the air in the room shifted. Victoria's head lifted, sensing something wrong, her tear-reddened eyes fixing on me. We can't discuss full details over the phone, the rep continued, but there has been recent activity on the trust account, large attempted withdrawals flagged as suspicious. My heart slammed once, hard, like it was warning me. Withdrawals. I repeated, though the word tasted wrong. Yes, Mr. Mitchell. Someone tried to access the trust using outdated authorization codes. Outdated authorization codes. Victoria's face went pale, and I realized she could hear enough on my side to piece something together. Who attempted it? I asked, my voice lower now, steadier than I felt. There was another pause. We can only say the login attempt came from someone who had partial, but not complete, information about the trust structure. Enough to try, but not enough to succeed. I exhaled through my teeth. Are the funds secure? Yes. but we suggest you visit the office as soon as possible. There are documents you need to see." I thanked them and hung up slowly. Victoria's fingers curled around the edge of the letter. "Tom, what does that mean? Someone tried to get into the trust? Who would even know how?" I didn't answer right away. I sat across from her, watching her face cycle through confusion, fear, and dawning realization. "Victoria," I said carefully, "you told me earlier today that someone else might have known about the trust. What did you mean by that?" Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked toward the papers she'd brought, shaking slightly. "It's just, when I was going to the storage unit, there were boxes that looked moved, like someone had gone through them before I got there. Some things were out of place. Some files I never saw before were opened." Her voice dropped. "And the unit isn't supposed to have a spare key, but the lock looked scratched." I stood slowly. A chill crept through the house, as if the walls themselves were listening. "Victoria," I said, "who else had access to that storage unit?" She blinked, confused. "No one. Just me and David. After he died, I kept the key in my desk drawer because the intern's message. I picked. They were looking for a way in. Silent room. shook her head over and over. Name, faint but visible. Someone had made a note. Asked about backup boxes. Backup boxes. The same ones David mentioned in the video. The same ones that held trust copies, financial records, the kind of documents someone like Brent could use to manipulate, extort, or impersonate authority. Victoria pressed her fingers to her temples, shaking violently. Tom, he was there. That night, he was there. He followed David. She cut herself off, too horrified to finish the sentence. But my mind finished it for her. Brent had been digging. Brent had been observing. Brent had been waiting for an opportunity. And David, in his anxious, loyal need to protect everyone else first, hadn't warned the police because he didn't want to escalate something he wasn't yet certain about. My hands tightened into fists, not out of anger, but out of a cold, protective instinct that swept through me like a storm. Victoria, I said slowly, we need to take this to the authorities. Tonight. She nodded numbly, wiping tears from her cheeks, but the fear didn't lessen. Tom, what if David's accident wasn't an accident at all? I looked at the screen again, at the timestamp, at the names, at the careful paranoia in my son's final recordings, and I felt the truth settling like a stone at the bottom of a well, heavy, immovable, step out of shadow at any moment. The fear wasn't irrational. Now that we had evidence of attempted account breach, we had become liabilities to whoever was profiting from the silence. When we stepped outside, to reveal the face watching us. The truth hit me harder than any document ever could. Brent wasn't afraid of what we knew. He was afraid we were finally ready to expose him.